should we take bets on how long it takes somebody to mention ChatGPT and AI? And I think they managed it 6 minutes before it literally was like, what about AI?
Hello and welcome to the TA Tech Talk podcast, where conversation meets technology, and we're going to delve into the world of all things tech. So let's geek out with my awesome guest of the week. We've got the wonderful Samantha O'Leary.
Hi, Nick.
Hi, Sam. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. How are you?
Yeah, not too bad. Thank you for joining me. Now,
No problem.
a bit of a confession here to make is we're actually colleagues, but we don't get together very often because you're poles apart and we're at one place, you're at the other. So it's really great to have you in the flesh and book you in because you're a busy woman, aren't you?
I am. Spent a lot of time kind of in schools up and down the country, so it's nice to be sort of able to touch base and actually have a meaningful conversation. So
well, that's great. Well, we talk all things tech on this, and you're fully immersed in the world of EdTech and that realm of education. And I mean, maybe you should tell us a little bit about what you do. So you're an MIE expert amongst other things. Maybe kind of elaborate on that for us.
Absolutely. So I am a former teacher. So I spent many years as an English teacher and a head of department and in various roles in education. But I've always been a bit of a bit of a geek around the use of technology, and particularly around the use of technology in the classroom space. So now what I do is I provide training for schools, for teachers. I work with students as well around how to get the most out of using technology for teaching and learning, for sort of making life easier, but also just to really kind of explore different skills that I think are really relevant for today, but also across the future, with exciting kind of landscapes like AI, sort of really looking at how they're working in education now. It's sort of an interesting time for teachers to develop those skills.
Yeah, well, it's funny, over the last couple of years, it's been a strange one, isn't it, with education and technology in particular, especially with the events of what happened with COVID and lockdown. And I'm not fully immersed in it like you are, but from an outside point of view, it seemed like all of a sudden there was like this great need for more technology in the classroom, and everyone seemed to be playing catch up, and then it got to a point where, oh my God, like we've got technology in the classroom finally. But is that the kind of the case how it's continued since COVID? What have you seen? How did COVID impact technology in the classroom to begin with? Was it like all hands to the deck,
Absolutely. So I think schools were in sort of varying degrees of position. So some schools had already adopted technology. Some schools, the school I previously worked at, we were a school that had a device for every student in an academy setting, and so sort of we were, I think, ahead of the curve in many ways around sort of how we were employing the use of technology for teaching and learning. But that was actually not the case for many schools. So what you had when the pandemic hit is schools either needed to adopt a cloud platform, or they had a cloud platform they weren't making the use of particularly, and suddenly they had to pivot around to learn how to deliver sort of everyday teaching and learning through a different, well, quite literally a different lens. And so, sort of for teachers, that was a massive upturn in terms of their skills and in terms of their need to understand how technology could be used to facilitate teaching and learning during those lockdown periods. I think since then, what we've actually seen, or certainly what I've seen kind of with the schools that I've been working with and with the schools I've been talking to, is that a lot of teachers are very much kind of in the realm where actually the skills that they built up are very much locked in with the negative connotations of lockdown. And so a lot of teachers kind of came back into the physical classroom, breathed a sigh of relief, and then a lot of those digital skills that they perhaps gained during the lockdown sort of period have become either lost or certainly are not necessarily being utilised in the sort of the way that they could be. So what we're actually seeing now is this push towards, well, where next? So for school leadership, it's about actually thinking about, well, digital technology, I've been doing this job for a very long time, it certainly predates COVID. Digital technology is not something that we've brought into schools because of COVID, obviously we have, but it's more a case actually now we say there was a place for digital technology and building digital skills for students, for teachers to save time. We know that the pressure on teachers is always immense, and so the more that we can give teachers tools to make the life outside of the classroom kind of more efficient and kind of automate some different things that means that actually their lives are far simpler in terms of administration, that's very useful and important. But actually also in the classroom, and we think about schools moving towards sustainability even, the idea of, sort of the impact on the climate in terms of how we use resources and what we do within schools, I think is becoming sort of more and more of a conversation now. So actually what we're seeing is schools really having to kind of stand back and think, well, during COVID, we were, for many schools, it was a knee-jerk reaction. It was very much, we're in an emergency situation, we need to put an emergency plan in place. And that was done, very effectively by many schools. But actually now what we're getting is, well, was that the right plan?
Yeah.
That was an emergency plan for an emergency situation, but is that the long-term plan, sort of across? So a lot of schools having to step back and say, what is it actually we want to do? Where do we want to place kind of our emphasis in terms of the use of technology in the classroom? It should never be, sort of the be all and end all of sort of teaching and learning. It should be I always talk about the another pen in the pencil case. It's another tool in the pencil case. I think for most teachers in this country, it was the steepest of learning curves we've probably ever seen.
Yeah.
And sort of, as I say, massive hats off to anybody who had to deliver live learning in that kind of context, because sort of I think it's and actually also hats off to the students engaging in that.
Well, that's what I was going to say about the student's perspective. I think we take for granted, don't we, that we think all young people know how to use every bit of technology. We've all got laptops, we've all got phones, but it's not as simple as that, is there? You can have a laptop, but you find that a lot of children maybe in the areas where the families aren't quite as affluent, so they don't have the computers at home. There is going to be a bit of a cultural and kind of financial divide there, isn't there? But I think we just assume that kids can use technology. So it's not just the teachers that need the teaching or the consultancy or whatever it might be. It's the children as well, isn't it? Oh,
absolutely. And there's even within that, if we unpack that idea for students, during COVID, there's a couple of different things there. The equity of access for devices was a massive conversation. Certainly when we think about a household that might have multiple siblings, so you might have sort of 3 or 4 children, and maybe they did have access to 1 or 2 devices, but actually then what happens for the other 2 students, and then how do you manage that? And if you've got timetabled lessons that are live, how do you make sure that sort of for parents that was a sort of really big consideration. So there is the kind of the access to technology, there's the skill base around using the technology, and it's not just about sort of knowing how to type things in a Word document or a Google Doc or sort of Apple Pages.
Sure.
It's effectively thinking about actually how do we know which tools are going to help us to complete a task. How do we get the most out of using that technology to move forward? For many students, those skills sort of are not there, particularly the younger students, and again, understandably so, because if it's not been part of their development in school, then actually, so it's not going to be something they naturally. I think a lot of people think it'll happen by osmosis, and that's not the case. There is also the idea of soft skills, I think, that really played in. I know that, how many adults, and I'm sure kind of anybody listening back to this, sort of would sort of perhaps reflect on how many of us struggled with being penned up, effectively, almost, perhaps seems extreme to say that we're kind of under house arrest, but we kind of were.
Sure,
and so for a lot of students, they're in that situation. So there is the emotional frustration, but perhaps they haven't necessarily got the soft skills to deal with those emotions, those feelings. They're not able to develop their social skills with their friends and sort of within the social context of school.
Yeah.
That was a big problem, I think, for many students and certainly for many teachers to support. And then you've also got the soft skills of managing your own learning and managing your own time and actually then and motivation.
Yeah.
The difficulty here is if you're sitting, you don't know how long it's going to last for. That was really, really complicated. Yeah. So I think for a lot of students, there was a big kind of learning curve of how they approached their learning. And for many, sort of that worked. For some, I think, they're probably still having to look back and sort of perhaps address. I won't talk about knowledge gaps, but actually I think the biggest gap we've seen has been for students with their own social and emotional skills.
Well, that's it. They're been away from all their peers and their teachers. And I think, from a point of view of psychology as well, trying to separate. A lot of kids go to school. That's where I learn, in that building there with that person. To swap that out for the home where you relax, you watch telly, you're with your parents. Psychologically, that must have been so tricky for them to kind of digest in their mind as well, mustn't it?
Absolutely. And I think without having, none of us had a context for the idea of the pandemic. None of us had sort of an understanding of how this was going to work at all. We didn't have a timeline. We didn't know if we were going to be on lockdowns for a few weeks. It could be months. We didn't know if it was going to be years. So for a lot of students, we didn't have the skills to or the breadth of understanding to be able to look at it, because it was a new quantity for us as well. But for students, obviously, sort of being younger, actually developing their own perspective, so the impact on mental health has been huge.
It would be interesting to see what the long-term effect is on that, and about the social skills when the further they go into education. Because I've got a young daughter. I mean, she was too young to be kind of wrapped up in the education system because she's very young. But even the development at nursery, even that young, I know they don't use technology as such at nursery as much. Well, they might do in some, but. The long-term effect for young kids, it must be it's going to be it take a fair few years to understand of how it is. But at the same time, I mean, you could look at it in a positive spin where they've been introduced to technology a lot quicker than they might have done before. So it could go either way, couldn't it?
I think that's a really important point to make. Is we could go down the doom and gloom route, but actually, I think there's a couple of things here. Students that have gone through this, and the younger children right through to sort of teenagers and sort of young adults, have actually probably had to be more resilient than we ever had to be, as children. So actually, from a positive point of view, they've developed potentially those resilient skills. But actually, from a digital point of view, and bringing this back to kind of the tech idea, perhaps there's more kind of, it's opened more doors to thought around tech. So I think for us, as we move forward, and for schools moving forward, it's very much about then how do we harness the skills that teachers have developed, the skills that students have developed and are still developing, and how do we then focus that on making it so that students are ready for future learning, for future employment. And actually also, sort of thinking about how we can deepen our understanding of topics and, sort of the way we connect ideas, the way that we develop our kind of understanding of real world problems and so on. Technology can really kind of open those doors in ways that, perhaps traditional teaching methods aren't always able to do. That's not to say that traditional teaching methods are, null and void. I think it's a blended approach. But it's very much about thinking about, well, how can we actually really make the most of the technology that we have available to us, and make it so that when students look at their learning and the wider world and tasks and that kind of thing, that they are able to say, well, that's the best tool to use for that particular job, or I could do this in this way, rather than just kind of, sort of going with whatever the expectation is, sort of traditionally.
So let's home in on tech a bit more, because we have talked about all sorts of What is the future of tech in the classroom then? So at the minute you've got, we're trying to introduce one-to-one devices. That's one of the first steps we're going to do. But where do you see technology developing within the classroom? AI is another big thing. There's development. Seems every week a new AI tool coming out. Do you think that's something? Because I read the other day about this new ChatGPT, and there's other formats of it, isn't there? That it might even replace 1 in 3 universities in the next 5 years, just because of the power of essay writing and online learning. Where is it for you?
It's an interesting one. I think in the immediate term, things like the introduction of one-to-one devices is a really big conversation with schools. Not because tech for tech's sake, but actually that idea, going back to the idea of the pencil case, that students, there is an equity of access across all of our students, that students can say, right, okay, actually I'm going to approach that task using technology, because actually that's going to be, for me, the better way to approach using that. Sure. So I think what we'll see from that is far more independence in terms of how students approach their learning journeys and how they approach accessing learning. AI is yeah, it's interesting because obviously over Christmas, kind of the whole chat GPT sort of conversation really blew up, and particularly kind of on Twitter. Everybody was kind of like, oh my God, this is my planning, and then of course it impacted then on, well, what about student responses? Yeah. And I think what we're going to see is that perhaps the way we design learning will potentially shift and change. Right. But actually that's because the way that we work, the way that we interact, the way that we develop socially, the way that we will do our daily jobs is going to be massively impacted. It already is being impacted by AI, but I think it's massively going to be. So I think what we'll see is a shift and change in the way that we design learning, and the way that we expect kind of student outcomes and that kind of thing. But it's a wonderfully interesting conversation to have in schools, because you get wildly different responses, and everybody wants to talk about it. So I was on a training session the other day, and I mentioned something, and in the planning call beforehand, I said to somebody, should we take bets on how long it takes somebody to mention ChatGPT and AI? And I think they managed it 6 minutes. Really? Before it literally was like, what about AI?
I mean, the marketing for this company, for this ChatGPT, I mean, just word of mouth alone, it's crazy, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's amazing. I mean, what a tool that is. Well, going to and the potential of it as well.
Well, and when we look at kind of moving forward, obviously Microsoft have gone into a deal with OpenAI, who are sort of the company kind of behind ChatGPT. And so what we'll actually see, I think, is that will be built more and more. AI is already built into a lot of the cloud-based tools that we use. Showing somebody a Microsoft form the other day, and the Microsoft offices, I'm shown kind of different things you can do in Microsoft Forms, and a lot of the AI, sort of machine learning sort of capabilities are already being built and have been built into the tools that we're actually using on a daily basis. I think we'll just see that expand even wider, and it will become, sort of an ingrained part of how we use technology. Rather than just being this kind of slight, at the moment, I think it's still slightly abstract for a lot of people.
It's a bit of a novelty, isn't it? I'll play with that.
Yeah, and it's kind of like AI, as a separate thing. I think actually what we'll see is that, and that's the natural way of the evolution of tech, is that will actually, it already is, but the way people perceive it, it will become an ingrained part of the way technology kind of impacts on our daily lives.
And what tech gets you excited now? I mean, what do you look forward to using on a daily basis? You got your laptops, but what tech do you like? What are you into?
Outside of the classroom, for me, I think sort of just being able to have anytime, anywhere access to, sort of my world of work. I can work anywhere I need to, and I do. Sort of I'm all over the country, and so to have that flexibility. What excites me, in the classroom, I love kind of the ability for students to use things like video feedback and audio and so on. So I'm a big proponent of Flip, and the use of flip.com, because I think has massive power in the classroom, and I love using that too. So, somebody turns around to me and says, how do you do something? I get these questions often, how do you do that, Sam? And actually for me, to be able to very quickly screen record that and ping that back, but without having to, sort of, for me, it's a 2-minute job rather than it taking a long time. So for me, where tech, I think, is incredibly exciting, is where we get the time to have freedom to be creative and to innovate, while the tech is actually, sort of saving us, sort of legwork,
Yeah.
if that makes sense.
This is kind of, I don't know if this is it's not an offensive question at all, but is it getting easier for teachers or harder for teachers now with technology? Because you've got things like, your forms and, the Teams, the capabilities within Microsoft Teams where you can have your work marked automatically. You just do one set of, answers and you're done. So back a few years back, you'd have to mark every essay by hand. So the teachers are saving themselves, in that respect. But is it harder because they're learning it all first, or is it easier for teachers now?
I think that's all a matter of perspective.
Sure.
That's definitely a massive matter of perspective.
Okay.
I think a difficulty is going to be for teachers is the skills and the time to invest in learning the skills, but then also creating content. So, it's a bit of a misnomer to think that, sort of perhaps everything gets marked kind of very quickly. Well, to have that happen, you have to kind of put, you have to put the building blocks in place to make that work. I think what we'll see is that sort of the tools that can be used will be used far more effectively and efficiently as we move forward. And then obviously they are always growing. So, sort of the hope for me is, I think that, sort of it's always going to be something that in the end will make life easier for teachers. But I think, sort of, if we're being honest, that requires, an upturn in skill. But most importantly, perhaps perspective. Sort of for many teachers, I think it's seen as, oh my God, that's going to such a massive hill to climb. I don't even know where to start. I try to remind people that actually they've already rolled the boulder up the hill during lockdown. So why let it roll you back down? Actually, you could just carry on going. And it's, sort of keeping that journey moving. And a big part of that is kind of getting people excited about, how something works. So, it's the light bulb moments in class for us as teachers are really important. And actually for me as a trainer with teachers, it is helping them find their light bulb moments.
How much has technology changed within education in the classroom? Well, that's probably five years, I suppose. What's been the biggest kind of thing you've seen?
It's a really, really interesting question, Nick. I think... let me take you back a bit further than 5 years just for a second.
Please, yeah.
If you take back to my first classroom, and I had a chalkboard, okay, and this is something it's quite often kind of, it's one of my lines when I'm out delivering training, so my first classroom had a chalkboard. I'm allergic to chalk dust. I spent a lot of time sneezing, which is true. And for the first 18 months of my teaching career, computing as an English teacher, computing and computers were really actually sort of not non-existent, but they were really not, important. For me as a teacher, it was maybe I designed, sort of some learning resources. We didn't have PowerPoint, we didn't have a projector at the time. There was no front of classroom technology at all. We didn't even really use email. Just to give you context, registers were still done on those big registers, and a kid would take the register back to the office. And I mean, that's only sort of just over 20 odd years ago now, which seems like a long time. But actually, if you think about the evolution of the use of technology in education in that 20-year period, and the evolution of front of classroom technology, so things like interactive whiteboards, through to digital displays, and sort of it's always ever evolving. And sort of how we as teachers use technology to deliver learning. And I think that's a real kind of interesting thing. When we think about the last 5 years, that shift is starting to be more away from how we deliver learning using technology and more about how we facilitate learning with technology. And the difference there is very much how I'm using tech and how the students are using tech. So I think what we've seen in the last certainly sort of 5 to 10 years is a rapid evolution of technology without a rapid evolution of support and training for teachers. So I was in a school fairly recently, and I basically sat in a sort of like a lecture theatre kind of set up with most of the staff of the school. And I asked them to raise their hands if they'd ever had any kind of conversations around technology as part of their teacher training. Had a mixed audience there. Sort of some people there have been teaching 30, 40 years. Some people have been teaching 3. Real wide range of people. And I asked the question, were you ever trained as a teacher to think about how technology is used from a pedagogy point of view. So that's from your learning design point of view, not, how do you manage a classroom, of like students in a computer room? How do you make sure they're all safe and they're not, get off, Googling things they shouldn't be and things like that, the behaviour management side of it. I actually sort of said, how much have we actually understood about how we use teaching, technology for actual teaching and learning? So thinking about how do we design learning outcomes, how do we give students access to different ways to approach learning using those digital tools, and actually nobody could put their hand up.
Right.
In a room of 70 people, nobody could put their hand up. And actually, I look back to my teacher training, and I had such valuable sessions on the teaching of poetry and the teaching of Shakespeare, and most of your teacher training is actually spent in schools, actually teaching students. But the times I spent at university and the courses that I was part of, the modules I was part of, lots of kind of really interesting kind of different ways to approach teaching literature and teaching language. Nothing about technology.
It's crazy, really.
Now, that's 20 years ago. But when you've got somebody in the room who really has only been trained 3 years ago, 4 years ago, that conversation is starting to change and move. And there are, many universities that are, building in digital into teacher training. But I still think that that's very much, sporadic at the moment. It's not consistent, really. So what we're actually seeing is the last 5 or 10 years, we've had this explosion of technology. We've had, the introduction of, a wide range of hardware in the classroom that can be used, for great benefit, but also, the adoption of cloud platforms.
Yeah. So
the adoption of Microsoft 365, the adoption of Google, the adoption of different options like, Edmodo or Show My Homework, or I think it's Satchel One now. But, whatever the learning sort of platforms are, that adoption of cloud technology has been a big part of the last, certainly part of the last 3 to 4 years with the pandemic, but actually the last 5 to 10 years in terms of how schools are approaching using technology. The problem is that we can bring as much technology into the classroom as we like, but if we, as teachers, if we don't know how to connect the dots, or we're not given the time and the support to connect dots, that's where the problem comes in. So I think for a lot of teachers, it's been a massive learning curve. We know that the last 3 years, has been a very steep learning curve, but certainly even before that. And so in terms of the evolution of the technology that we use, I think it's hopefully moved away from, although there are still very many cases of, a computer room, a traditional kind of computer room being used to research things, to look things up on the internet and type things up. I'd hope that we've moved away from that. It's not to say that those things aren't necessarily a part of what we're doing, but they should be a part of, rather than the only way that we use technology. Now, obviously, computing as a subject aside, and I always kind of try to differentiate between digital and computing, because I think actually that's, a key differentiator in many ways. But I think sort of computing aside from it, for every other subject area, for, in younger years, the learning of different things, the learning of English and maths and science and geography and, all the different subject areas. There is a need perhaps to understand how to use that range of digital technology to get the most out of those subject areas. Yeah. So,
I mean, I'm constantly being kind of like, oh my God, I can't believe you can do that now with technology. I mean, when was your first kind of memory of that? Like, what bit of technology do you remember thinking, oh my God, that's amazing. Like, that's going to change the way I do this. What's that for you?
That's an interesting one. So, I mean, obviously, moving away from, I'm old enough that I used to use an overhead projector, and I'd photocopy a poem onto acetate, onto acetate, and then I'd put it onto the overhead projector. I'd get my overhead projector pens out, and I'd annotate the poem with the kids.
Can I just quickly interrupt you there?
Sure.
I remember wanting to be the one at the classroom to sit next to the projector, so I can write it down before the I remember because my teacher used to cover off of it with a blank piece of paper, so you could move it slowly down. And
Yep.
I always could see through it. I forgot all about that.
Yeah. So, and that for me kind of was, and it was a staple part of teaching learning in terms of the English classroom. Anyway, it was a staple part of how sort of we approach teaching, sort of literature and texts in the classroom. And so I don't actually remember kind of transitioning to using, things like PowerPoint and so on. I did move away from using PowerPoint for many years because, death by PowerPoint is no student's friend. Yeah. But I think I can remember sitting in one of the schools I worked in, and it would have probably been about 14 or 15 years ago now, so a fair while. I can remember kind of doing a bit of CPD, a bit of inset, and somebody had come in to talk about Web 2. Kind of applications.
Right.
So things that are free out on the internet that we could use for teaching and learning, and just to perhaps shake things up, to disrupt education in the best way.
Yeah.
And I can remember them showing me Prezi, and this is how long ago this is now.
Okay.
And this was for us back at that time, sitting in what was effectively like the assembly hall in our tiered seating, watching this guy talk about kind of Prezi, and it was like. And of course, what did I do? I spent, the next few months making people feel seasick by making things spin around, because that's what you could do in Prezi. I think that kind of, whilst, sort of it didn't necessarily change much about, sort of what I was doing in terms of the classroom, really. Yeah. Perhaps it looked a bit more whizzy. Right. And actually maybe the kids were a bit like, oh, that's different. Yeah. So that whole kind of disrupting the expectations of the norm. Perhaps it did something there. But I think what it did is it made me think, hold on a second, actually, how else can I use technology? So it really, I think, planted a seed for me that hadn't been there necessarily before, because I think there was a natural transition between going from using like an OHP and, so I used to have this chalkboard, I'd bring the white, the white background down, and up the OHP would go, and, you'd get certain lighting, you'd have to clean and then the bulb would go. I think there was a natural transition from that to using a projector, like sort of an overhead projector. Sorry, not overhead projector, a digital projector. Yeah. With sort of a laptop connected to it, or a PC. I don't even remember actually what the first solution I had in the classroom with technology was, because it just naturally was like, oh, finally I don't have a chalkboard anymore and I have a whiteboard. That was the first move, and then once I'd moved to a whiteboard, actually then I got a projector and so on. I don't remember that, but I do remember sitting in that hall in the school that I was in, and just thinking, actually I wonder what else is out there. Yeah. I wonder what else I could do. And then I went off and started making kind of word clouds. And we, sort of when we were talking about kind of, sort of taking a text, and again, it's a simple thing, but taking a text and then taking kind of the most used words in the text against kind of the slightly lesser used words. So you take kind of mice and men, and you talk about kind of light and dark, or the themes. Sure. And you start to use word clouds to kind of think about the language that's used in the text. Okay. And again, it's quite a simplistic thing, but again, it's me using the technology. And I think the key thing for me now, and perhaps, links back to this idea of the last 5 to 10 years, is we really need to be thinking about how the students are using technology. It's a lot less about how I'm kind of, creating the whiz-bang in the lesson, and actually how I'm using tools to deliver, learning content, and more about how students are accessing digital tools and content, digitally, and then, sort of being able to create their own learning outcomes and almost be independent about how they take their own learning journeys.
I suppose you could create the best resources or use the best technology yourself, but if they've not got the ability or the tools to do so, it's pointless, isn't it?
It's absolutely pointless. What digital skills are they learning from seeing me do something? I need them to be able to develop those skills. And I think, sort of, as I've always been a bit geeky, a bit nerdy, particularly around technology. I've always been a bit of an anomaly in many ways, because I'm an English teacher by at heart and by nature, who is actually really passionate about the use of technology. And quite often the two things, and also a woman in technology, and the three things actually are thankfully less so now, but when I was first kind of, sort of on this journey as an EdTech consultant and trainer, I was a mass anomaly, because actually the three things don't tend to go together, really? In that kind of combination. But because I've always been a bit geeky, perhaps I will try and push the boundaries of things. So I started off very, quite small, and then, sort of actually as we went one-to-one as a school, and every student had a device, it challenged me to kind of really break the mould of what I was doing in the classroom. But actually, I think when we go back to it, yes, I was pushing the students. But if I went back now, and looked back, reflectively, I would want to be looking at giving them much more opportunity to approach their learning with an independence, I think.
Okay. So. And what about now then? So what was the last bit of tech that you've used and thought, God, this is amazing. Where's this all been all my life? What now? Is there anything recently that you've done that with?
I definitely think the opportunity for us to use AI in education is a really interesting and varied kind of a topic to approach. I certainly think that it's going to really open up doors to sort of how we approach planning lessons, how we approach kind of delivering lessons, what lessons actually even look like, potentially. It doesn't mean that we're not still learning, sort of the things that we would learn generally anyway. It's just how we do that. Yeah. And I think for me, kind of the interesting thing about AI is definitely going to be, sort of how we see that grow in the natural way we work. Right. And we're already seeing it. It's there already. Perhaps people aren't even recognising it. And that's for me, so if you ask me what I think, sort of in terms of tech that I've used recently, just the ability to have a Microsoft form auto-populate itself.
Yeah, that's just simple things, isn't
it's a simple thing that's still a kind of a bit of a... because actually what we're seeing then is I'm not having to do... There's always a feeling, I think, of having to do too much legwork with certain things. And, sort of, particularly in education, really particularly in education, this feeling of, it's probably just quicker to do that, not using the technology, particularly if I don't have the skills really or the knowledge and understanding. I'm just going to go kind of down the route of pen and paper and traditional. And I think actually what we'll see moving forward is, and we already are seeing actually, is actually it's quicker. Because I'm not having to do the legwork, and actually a lot of it's already there. Yeah. I'm not necessarily having to learn, sort of a lot of unnecessary things to make things work, because it just works. Yeah. I don't need to know how to code, a really simple thing. I mean, it's not new technology at all. But I was showing a school Microsoft Sway this week, just to talk about digital storytelling. And, sort of the simplistic kind of nature of just being able to create something. I don't need to know how to code a web page. Yeah. I mean, I could probably manage it. But again, it would be through spending a lot of time, sort of with internet research and possibly harassing my partner, who knows how to do these things. But actually, sort of for everybody, and that's for students as well, just having kind of the technology available opens so many different doors. It becomes something that's not exclusive anymore. Yeah. It's something everybody can do.
It's funny the way it's changing. For me, I obviously do a bit of TikTok, as people may know. And one of the things I found on TikTok now is the way people are searching for things. So people, to say traditionally, but over the last 10, 15, 20 years, have used Google as a search engine to search for an answer. But I'm finding myself, in particular, looking on TikTok. So if I want to find something like for dinner, I'll look on TikTok for a recipe, because I think people want that short. Like YouTube, obviously, is still going to be. I think it's the second biggest search engine. I think TikTok, the short form content on the speed to get that information, I find it's like, I think that's the way it's heading towards, that real quick video format content. I know I'm kind of contradicting myself here because I want to do longer form content like a podcast, but I think people like that quick information as well, which is it's. Yeah, I think that's where things are heading for me.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, sort of, it's part of the reason why I'm looking at how we can support teachers with, sort of that bite-sized content, because actually, sort of people have already developed the wider skills, the larger skills around things, but actually just knowing how to do that particular one thing. It's why, sort of Tech Tips works so well, because it's that, that's something I didn't know, I can go and do that now. Yeah. Oh, look, you can use that shortcut to do that particular thing. Oh, that's going to actually save me a lot of time. Yeah. So I think that's really, really important. important. I think the key thing for education, though, you raise a really important point that, sort of content on YouTube or content on TikTok or content on, social media generally, the validation of that content. So for students, the key thing is being able to recognise, what is actually validated real content. And I think the fact that it's out there, we all use, you say YouTube is the second most search engine. Who here hasn't, gone onto YouTube to find the answer of how to do something? It's my first port of call. Something wrong with my car? Okay, before I take it to a garage, I'm going to go on YouTube and see if I can go and fix it first.
100%.
I'm going to go, don't know how to do something with a piece of technology. Piece of technology, or an area of technology. I'm going to go and see if there's some nerdy person there, and sometimes it's me is the nerdy person that puts things out there. But I'm going to go and look and find kind of that content. So I think so it is such an amazing resource base to be able to access. But I think for students being able to discern, what is actually something that they can trust and believe.
Mm-hmm.
Is actually really, really important, and actually being able to say that's something that I think is a really valid source, and I'm going to use that information, but actually that I would want to check and make sure that actually that's a valid source. I think that's probably the biggest challenge for students with using that kind of resource base. But I'm excited to see kind of, how it's going to develop moving forward.
I mean, one thing I've just kind of come into my head now, I mean, the fact that I've just said that, I think shorter form content, because the shorter attention spans, for you may be young, but I might be wrong. For me, I like shorter form, quick videos to get the information. Mm-hmm. Do you think that will impact, or do you think that's something to consider with the length of how long kids are in a classroom for, and how long they're being taught for? What's the average lesson? 40 minutes or so? 40, 50
it varies, anywhere between sort of 40 to 45 minutes and an hour.
Well, if attention span is getting shorter, I'm kind of just plucking that information out there, I suppose, in a way. I've not seen research on it. But if that is the case, do you think that needs to be considered when it comes to teaching?
Oh, you're opening Pandora's box there, Nick. Because I can tell you now, as a teacher of many years, that actually sometimes you need time to teach things. And you can't treat the classroom in that kind of short form content kind of way. But what we can do is think about how we design the learning experience within the hour.
I suppose that's what I'm kind of getting to, really. Not necessarily having 10-minute classes and move on to the next one. You know what I mean?
You spend 10 minutes getting to the next class. I think actually it's we think about learning design and we think about kind of lesson design. And it goes back to what I was saying about sort of, I think, cloud-based platforms, and particularly kind of the impact of AI kind of moving forward is going to change potentially learning design. But I think you're right, there is room to consider how we approach kind of a learning sequence, and a lot of teachers are already doing that. A lot of teachers, any teachers kind of watching this might be sat there going, well, we're already doing that, Sam. Actually, fair. You are already doing this. But I think there are also still classrooms where there isn't that consideration about how we use kind of our learning design to engage, moving forward. So, so it is a prime conversation for many schools, for many teachers. How do we kind of make it so that, I think we don't want to kind of move away from, the depth, depth versus time kind of conversation. We don't want to move away from the depth that we need students to be able to get to in learning different areas and different subjects and different topics. And so we need to be careful, I think, not to kind of almost go too far in the other direction and actually say, everyone's attention span is a lot smaller. I think there is a real kind of need to look for balance and think actually, what is it about the way we approach learning and attention within that realm that we need to not necessarily change, but perhaps adapt and move forward in, the current climate and the future.
Lovely. Well, I think we're pretty much out of time, Sam. I mean, I could talk to you all day about this kind of stuff. And there's probably so much more we could probably cover. So yes, you're with TA.education, and you do a bunch of stuff with a bunch of different schools. You support them in loads of different ways, don't you?
Absolutely. So at TA Education, we basically work with schools, with trusts, with groups of schools, with independent schools, with state schools, basically with anyone working in the education sphere, to help them to look at how they're designing learning, think about the wider kind of vision of a school, but also then actually delivering training with teachers in the classroom. We even do work with students as well, so feel free to head on over and kind of check us out. We're always happy to have a chat about what we do, and I think just at the heart of what we do, I hope that comes across, is that really we're all just quite geeky teachers, sort of who are really passionate about how technology can be used in the classroom. So we're more than happy to have a chat.
Well, let me put your private mobile number on the screen right now. So if you want to get on to Sam, just give her a call. She's always free. No, that's been great, Sam. Thank you so much for joining me.
Welcome. Thank you for having me.
No worries. I'll speak to you again. Cheers.
Brilliant.